Hi everybody, it's nice to see you again. You remember last time we looked at two little boys, Moses and Samuel, and how as little babies and little toddlers they were adopted and they grew up in other homes, and how God used them as mighty prophets for him when they grew up. Today we're going to look at two little girls and how God chose them, each of them, to do something very heroic that took a lot of faith in God and a lot of courage. Our first story takes place in our Bibles, in our Old Testament, in the book of 2 Kings, chapter 5. So maybe afterwards your parents, your grandparents, your teacher can help you look up in your Bible. 2 Kings, chapter 5, and we're going to learn about our first little girl and what it was like for her in her city where she grew up. So come on a little closer if you can and have a look at this scene. In the Old Testament, there was a lot of times when a neighboring kingdom, a neighboring city would get their army, gather their army all up together, and they would go marching against an enemy, and they would attack that other enemy's cities. And the cities in the olden days were surrounded by big high walls like these that you can see in this scene. And so when the people could see this invading army starting to come, they would all gather up their children, their animals, their pets, any food that they could grab, and they would run into the city, get behind these big strong walls, slam the gates shut, and hope that the enemy would give up and leave them alone. So the enemies would come with all their armies, their soldiers, their equipment, and what they were wanting to do was they just started bashing and bashing against the walls of the city in wanting to knock it down so that they could go in and storm the city and steal everything and take people captive. So in this scene, we've got some of the equipment that the invading armies would use to attack these big city walls. So right back here, they would build a tall tower out of wood, and you can see the stairs going up to the different levels. And what they would try and do was get as high as the walls of the city, and then they would throw things over and shoot arrows and spears over top of the walls, and even try and jump from the tower on top of the walls. They also would use, you can see here, they had like a catapult which was loaded with arrows and spears, and they would shoot those over the walls and hope that they could hit people. And here we've got another type of catapult where they would set fire to an arrow, a torch, and shoot that over the walls and hope that they can set the houses on fire. And they would use catapults with big stones in them to bash against the walls. And here we have a big battering ram that they would use against the wooden doors or set fire, and they would just smash and smash and smash against the walls while the poor people were inside just hoping and praying that the enemy would give up and leave. Because this fighting against the walls of the city, they might do it for a few days, they might do it for a month, 2 months, sometimes years. The armies would be outside trying to break into a city. And the poor people on the inside, they would begin to run out of water, they would be running out of food, they would get sick. It was just a horrible experience to be inside these walls and seeing all these armies of people outside trying to get in and capture your city. And eventually, if they did break through into the city walls, the invading army, they would burn the whole city down. They would knock down every stone wall that they could find. They would capture all the people, the families, the children, and they would transport them. The people would become like refugees. You might have seen refugees on TV, or they were prisoners of war, and they would be taken, and they were weak by this point and sickly, and army would take them and march them away from their town, and they would have to march sometimes for days and weeks to a new foreign city, or a place where they'd never been before, where they didn't speak the language, where the culture was different. And these people believed in God, in the true God, whereas the invading armies, they had other gods that weren't gods at all. And that made for a really horrible, horrible, tragic experience for all the people. So the two little girls that we're going to look at today, both of them went through this experience where they were inside a city and an invading army came, destroyed their city, they lost their parents, and they got taken as a prisoner of war to a new city. So I'm just going to change my scene here and we'll have a look at our little girl. So here's the little girl I was telling you about, whose city was attacked and destroyed. And she lost all her family, her parents, all her friends. She lost everybody, and she was marched off like a slave. And she was brought to the enemy city where she had to learn the language, she had to learn the different clothes and the food and the manners and culture of the people. And the most important thing was that the country where she was sent as a slave did not believe in the same God that she did. She believed in the true God, the God of Israel, the only God. And the people where she was living now had all sorts of different gods that weren't gods at all. So she was very alone. But you know, even though she was alone, she didn't have her family, she didn't have her mom or dad anymore, she knew that the God of Israel, the God who had looked after her when she was growing up, when she was living in Israel, that God didn't just abandon her and let her go off all by herself. That God went with her and was with her in her new country and still loved her and still cared for her, and she still loved God with all her heart. Now the home that she went to be a slave, here we have the lady of the house. This woman was the wife of the commander of the army that had come and destroyed her city. And this is where she was a slave. She worked, she would sweep the floors and wash the walls and do the laundry and get water and help her mistress do all the different little tasks that she needed, comb her hair maybe. So this is where she was slave. And our Mrs. Naaman is her name, Mrs. Naaman. She began feeling quite sad and worried because her husband, the commander of that big army, had a really serious skin disease, which was incurable. There was nothing they could do about it, and it was going to get worse and worse and worse. And so to the point where he wouldn't be able to live at home anymore. He wouldn't be able to go out with the army and be the commander of his of the soldiers anymore. He'd have to go off and live by himself in some little tiny hut somewhere because of the disease as it got worse and worse. And they tried everything. Mrs. Naaman and her husband, the commander. They went to their gods, they went to the temples, they gave sacrifices and offerings, they said prayers, they did everything they could to try and heal him, and nothing worked. So finally, our little slave girl, our good little Christian girl, she said to her mistress, "If only my master would go back to Israel and to the prophets that are there, because I know the true God, the real God of Israel, would be able to heal the commander of this army." So she immediately told her husband what this little girl said. Said, "If you go back to Israel, the God there can heal you." So Naaman, the commander Naaman, he thought, well, it's worth a try. Nothing else has worked, and my disease is getting worse and worse. So thanks to this little girl, he had one more chance to go back and see if he could be healed. So I'm just going to change my scene and we're going to see what happened. So Commander Naaman, he got into his chariot and with some of his soldiers, and he went back to Israel and found the prophet named Elisha. And Naaman got out of his chariot and he said to Elisha, "I've heard that your God is big enough to heal me of my disease. Is this true? And if so, what is it that I have to do? What great thing do I have to do to please your God so that your God will heal me of my disease?" And the prophet said to him, "Go down to the river Jordan and go into the river and dip down 7 times. Dip under the water, come up, dip down under the water, come back up, dip down, come back up 7 times, and you'll be healed." Well, that made Naaman really cross. He thought, I'm too important a person to go wading into the water and splashing around in dirty rivers. If he had to pay heaps of money or make huge sacrifices or had to bow down to the God of Israel, he would have done that. But he just thought going into the river and dipping under the water was beneath him, and he didn't want to. But his fellow soldiers said to him, "Well, what harm will it do? Just try it, and if it works, good. If it doesn't, well, you go home and we'll try something else." So Naaman got out of his chariot, and he slipped out of his robes, and he went into the river, and he began dipping down. Once up, twice up, 3 times, 4 times, 5, 6 times. He kept looking at his skin. Nothing had happened. He was still covered in disease. He went down finally 7 times, came up, and his skin was perfectly clear. He had been completely healed. In fact, the Bible said his skin was just like a newborn baby's. It was so perfect. He couldn't believe it. He looked at his legs and arms, at his chest, his face. All that skin disease was gone. So he leaped out of that river, as happy as can be, all healed up. And he was so grateful that he took all the invading armies that were all throughout Israel, and they went back home to their own kingdom, and they never invaded Israel again. And that was thanks to our little girl, who wasn't really there with Naaman at the river, but we're going to bring her here anyway. Thanks to her and standing up and saying, "My God can help you," she saved her people from these horrible armies. Now we're going to look at another little girl, a prisoner of war, and see what she did. So you remember our little slave girl, who she was brave enough to do one great thing for God by speaking up for God and saying that he could heal the enemy. And thanks to her bravery, her whole people was saved from having invading armies and wars and sieges against their cities, thanks to her one brave deed. So now we're going to look at another girl who was a prisoner of war, whose city was destroyed and her parents were killed, and she was forced to go and live in a foreign country where they didn't believe in the true God. And there she was all by herself, and she also was asked by God to do one big, brave thing for God. And her name is Esther. And in our Bible, she's got a whole book devoted to her called the Book of Esther in our Old Testament. So there again, you have your mom or your grandparents or your teacher show you in the Bible the Book of Esther, all about our wonderful, brave girl. Now, she's a little older than probably most of you. When our story takes place, she was probably around maybe 14 or 15 years of age. And when she got to this foreign country, this whole new land, she didn't have any family or parents, but fortunately, she had an uncle. named Mordecai. And Mordecai adopted Esther and took her into his home and treated her and loved her like his own daughter and raised her up to believe in God, to read the scriptures, to be a woman of dignity and holiness and believing in God. And she was quite the tremendous young girl. She was a very intelligent girl. She had real poise and leadership qualities to her that made her stand out. But what she did not do was let all the people that she lived with in her village and in her city, she didn't tell them that she was a foreigner, that she was a Jewish girl that from another country. She just pretended that this was her land, these were her people, and this is where she'd been born and raised. Because when you were, like in a lot of countries, when you're an outsider who come to live with them, and people are not always happy to see outsiders living in their town. So she was very careful to not tell. And Mordecai, her uncle, advised Esther to just not say anything, just be very quiet, but we'll continue to be good Christian, God-fearing people. Now there was a great king who not only was king over this city where Esther was living, he was king over many cities and over many countries and lands, very powerful. And he decided that he wanted to have a special queen, a queen that was deserving to be by his side and to reign as king and queen over this huge empire. So he had his officials from the palace go out throughout all the land, and any time they saw a young girl who looked promising, who had that intelligence and beauty and poise and learning, and who had that ability to be a good queen, that they were to invite her to go back to the palace and get special training, and from all these girls the king would choose who was going to be queen. So, and as it turned out, Esther was one of the girls that was chosen to audition to be the queen of the land. So Mordecai told her, you be careful, you do everything that they tell you, but remember that you are a God-fearing young woman and don't do anything that you shouldn't do, but bring honor on your God. So off she went, and she left her village, left Mordecai living with him, and went to live in the palace of the king. So Esther went to live in the palace, and that's where she was going to live for the rest of her life. And for a whole year, she and the different girls who had been chosen to audition to be queen were given special education. Their learning, their reading and writing was improved. They were taught how to conduct themselves, how to dress, how to eat at the different feasts that the king would have, so that they would be ready for their new role. And every day, Mordecai used to come to the gates of the palace and sit there and wait to hear something from Esther, and she would come to the wall up top and she would say hello to him every day, and they would find out how each one was doing, and if they were well and safe, because they loved each other so much and they missed each other. So that went on for a whole year. And then the time came when the king was going to choose who was going to be his queen. And I bet you know what happened, don't you? Esther was chosen to be queen. So Esther became the queen of the huge empire with the king here. But she still hadn't told that she was actually a Jewish girl from Israel. He thought that she was one of his own people, born and bred. And it turned out not long after Esther became queen that the king foolishly signed a law to say that all the Jewish people who were living in his kingdom were to be destroyed. They were to be killed and driven out of the land. And Esther, at first she was going to not say anything because she was afraid for her own life, because she was Jewish. But Mordecai, her uncle, said to her, Esther, this may be the very reason why God chose you to be the queen, is so that you can save your people. Just like the little slave girl, remember when she had to speak up and tell Naaman about the prophet and her God who could heal Naaman? She had to stand up to save her people. So did Esther have to stand up to save her people. And she was nervous because the king could decide, I'm sorry, if you're Jewish, you have to go as well. Or he might accept and listen to what she had to say. So she prayed about it. She had Mordecai pray. She had all the Jewish people in the city and in the land praying for her. And then she put on her best robes and her queenly crown. And she went to the king and she told him, I am a Jewish woman as well. And if you follow through on this law to kill and destroy all the Jewish people, you will have to kill me too. So the king felt really horrible about what he had done. And he changed the law and saved the people. And thanks to Esther, her people were saved because she obeyed God, because she believed that it was for this reason, this one important job that God wanted her to do, and she was faithful and she believed in God enough that she stepped up and did what she was called to do. So that took some courage on her part. It took some courage on the part of the little slave girl, but they both did it, and we still talk about them today, these two heroes from our Bible. Next week, we're going to look at two little boys, ordinary little boys, who both of them grew up to be king. See you later. Bye now.